Cell-to-cell communication unit. So we're going to talk about the nervous system and the endocrine system in this unit. And this has to do with your brain and your spinal cord and all your nerves. And this one has to do with hormones. So we're going to spend most of our time on the nervous system, which is what we'll start today. So section 1, nervous system. This coordinates the activities of all the other systems, and it's responsible for maintaining homeostasis. So homeostasis is the ability to keep everything the same. So if you're cold, your receptors will send messages to your brain, which is the nervous system, right? And your brain will figure out what to do and send messages out to your muscles to shiver. So that's one of the ways that it maintains homeostasis. So the functions, sensory information is information going in. And so here's a receptor in the skin, maybe for pressure or for cold or whatever temperature. And the information will go in here to the spinal cord. So that's sensory information going in. So you've probably learned all the different senses, like hearing and sight and touch and all that stuff. And so that would all be bringing information into your brain or your spinal cord. The next one is integration. This is what your brain and your spinal cord do. So stuff like thinking or interpreting stuff. Even a simple reflex would be considered integration. And then the last one is motor output. So motor starts with an M, and so does movement, and so do muscles. So this is information going out. So the information already came in. Here's the sensory neuron's not shown. Here's the motor neuron. And here's the muscle. Sensory information would come in. Here's the interneuron, that would be this part. And here's the motor neuron, which would bring information out. And usually we're going out to a muscle or to a gland. And so remember, M for motor, M for muscle, M for movement. So here's the summary. So here's sensory information going in. Here's a neuron to represent either the brain or maybe could be just one neuron in the spinal cord, or it could be a whole, thousands of neurons in the brain. And then here's a motor neuron bringing information out to the muscles, for example. So you see water, and maybe you sense that you're thirsty, and that information goes in on sensory neurons to the brain to say, hey, you better do something about it. And the brain figures out what to do, sends messages to the muscles so you can pick up your glass of water and have a drink. So sensory neuron, you can label this thing as a sensory neuron. You can label this motor output, this is the motor neuron. And then the neurons that do integration are called interneurons. So I'll label those. Here's the simplest type of loop. And so this is called a reflex arc, which means that you have some kind of stimulus here. Maybe you stepped on a nail or something, or touched something hot. The information is going in along a sensory neuron. And then you have usually an integration neuron here in the spinal cord. Could be in the brain, but in this case it's the spinal cord. Sometimes you actually don't have that one. Sometimes it goes right from sensory to motor, but typically you have this interneuron in the middle, and then information goes out along the motor neuron to move a muscle, and that maybe pulls your foot away from the nail. Typically you have your reflex before you even have processed what's happened. So if you ever think about touching a hot stove, you're going to pull your hand away even before you've registered that, oh my God, it's hot, it's hot, it's hot. And can't see the video. Okay, so organization of the nervous system. So there's the central nervous system, and if you think about central, that means sort of the middle or the important part, and that's the brain and the spinal cord. So the brain is this part, and the spinal cord is this part. So these are the integration and command centers. That's what figures out what to do. So outside the central nervous system, you have what's called the peripheral nervous system. And so that would be all of these neurons that are bringing information out or bringing information in. And if you think about peripheral, like your peripheral vision, you're looking right at something. Peripheral vision is all the stuff that you're not looking right at. Or if you think about perimeter, the perimeter of a square or the perimeter of your house lot or whatever, it's the outside part. So peripheral means all the neurons that are not part of the brain or the spinal cord. So these are paired spinal and cranial nerves. If they're spinal, that means they're coming out of the spinal cord. If they're cranial, they're coming out of the brain right to your face, for example. These carry messages between the spinal cord or brain and the rest of the body. So this is the sensory stuff saying, hey, I feel cold or feel whatever, and motor neurons telling your body what to do about it. So the divisions of the peripheral nervous system, there's the sensory stuff. So this carries impulses from the skin, muscles, joints, and other organs into the central nervous system, the brain and spinal cord. And so for sensory, you should jot down in, that brings messages into the brain and the spinal cord. And then the other one is the motor division, carries impulses from the brain and spinal cord to muscles and glands. Sometimes we call them effectors. So this one is going out of the central nervous system to your muscles. Causes movement usually. Okay, if we look at the motor division, so let's go backwards here. Sensory is kind of all I want you to know about that. If you look at the motor division, there are two types of motor divisions. So there's the somatic nervous system, and that means body. And this affects all of your skeletal muscles. So remember when we did muscles, you learned about skeletal muscles, and you learned about cardiac muscle, and that was in your heart. And then you learned about smooth muscle, and that was in your iris of your eye. It was in your blood vessels and in your intestines and all those internal organs in your belly. And so the somatic nervous system is the skeletal muscle. And is that voluntary or involuntary? Well, you can choose to talk or walk or itch your head or whatever. So that stuff is voluntary. The skeletal muscles are voluntary. Sorry, autonomic nervous system. So there's the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. If you think of auto, that's automatic, and something that's done automatically, you just do, you don't have to think about. So this regulates the smooth muscles, cardiac muscles, and glands, and that is involuntary. You don't even have to think about any of that. So the autonomic division is further divided into two parts. So this is the stuff that you don't have to think about. So sometimes the stuff that you don't have to think about is really stressful, and let's say this a different way. Sometimes your body's response in a stressful situation is going to be very different from your body's response in a very calm situation. So for example, right now you're listening to me talk and it maybe is a little bit boring. I'm going to bet your heart rate is low and your blood pressure is low and you're kind of calm. If all of a sudden you hear someone at the door and you're home alone and there's someone breaking into your house and you've got to run for the phone and dial 911, bet your heartbeat's going to go up and I bet your breathing's going to go up and I bet you'll feel sick to your stomach. So that's these automatic responses that you don't have to think about. During a stressful situation when you have to fight or run, you don't want to say, okay, heart, you need to pump harder. Your body does that automatically. So there are two divisions of the autonomic nervous system. There's the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. The sympathetic starts with an S and it operates under stressful conditions. So a wild animal runs into the classroom and it's foaming at the mouth and you think it's going to eat you. Your blood pressure is going to go up, your heart rate's going to go up. You won't send blood to your digestive system, you'll send it to all your muscles. So increases heart rate, blood pressure, blood flow to the muscles. You don't want to be like that most of the time. Hopefully most of the time you are living in peace. So the parasympathetic operates under peaceful conditions. So your heart rate is nice and calm, your blood pressure is nice and normal, you're sending blood to your digestive system. So those are the two divisions of that. So let's put it all together. The nervous system is divided into your brain and spinal cord, which is your central nervous system, versus your peripheral nervous system. And so I'm going to write all that down in a second. Let's just get through this and then you can pause it so you don't have to write it yet. The peripheral nervous system is separated into the sensory and the motor. Sensory brings information into the brain and spinal cord, what you see, what you hear, what you feel, all that stuff. Motor neurons, starts with an M, sends messages out to the muscles to make them move typically. And there are two types of motor stuff. There's the stuff you control and the stuff you don't control. So somatic is out to the muscles that you control, that's voluntary. Autonomic, that controls the stuff you don't have to think about, like your heart rate. So there are two divisions there. There's the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. And you might be thinking, okay, this is just something that we have to memorize and, sometimes you send more messages to your heart or whatever to make it go faster. But actually, this is a real division. If you look at the impulses, if you look at the neurons sending messages to your heart, there are different neurons that are part of the sympathetic nervous system and totally different neurons that are the parasympathetic system. So you have it's actually a physical difference. It's not just something that people have come up with so you can memorize more stuff in biology. So let's put all this stuff in. Central nervous system is the brain and the spinal cord. Peripheral nervous system are all the nerves that are not in the brain and the spinal cord. There are two divisions, sensory and motor. The sensory neurons are bringing information to the brain and spinal cord, and that kind of neuron actually looks different than the motor neurons, which bring information from the central nervous system to effectors like muscles, for example. So if you don't like the word effectors, you can write in muscle or gland. And so the interesting thing here is it brings information in to the brain and spinal cord, so into the central nervous system, whereas motor brings information from the central nervous system out to the muscles. There are two types of those. There's the ones that you can control, like your skeletal muscle, and then the ones that happen automatically, like your heartbeat. So there's the voluntary stuff and the involuntary stuff. You're going to itch your nose, you're going to go for a walk. That's all voluntary, that's somatic. Your heart is going to beat, you're going to digest your food. That's all involuntary. If you look at the involuntary, there's the stuff that makes your heart go fast and the stuff that makes your heart relax. So the sympathetic one is the one that happens when you're stressed. Heart rate goes up, blood pressure goes up, digestive system goes down. And then parasympathetic, P for peace. So heart rate's slow, you're feeding, you're sending blood to your digestive system, all that stuff. All right, and that's it for today.